I'm joined today by Elliott Morris. His website is Strength in Numbers. He's the former lead data editor at 538. Before that place went downhill, and now he is the mind behind 50+1. If you follow election modeling or polling methodology, Elliott is one of the top voices in the field. He recently published a look at a wild three-way race in Montana where the independent candidate is currently outpacing the Democratic candidate against a Republican. We're going to unpack that data, look at some other numbers as well, and compare that to what we've seen here in Utah, because we had a similar situation in 2022, which is the main reason I wanted to talk to Elliott today. And we're also going to talk about where independent momentum might show up elsewhere in 2026. Elliott, great to have you on board.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Bryan.
So in your write-up of the Montana polling data, you showed that Seth Bodnar, an independent candidate, is currently outpolling the Democratic candidate, Alani Bankhead, in a three-way race against the Republican, Kurt Alme. Now, that poll shows that Bodnar is defeating Alme 50 to 44%. Alme defeats Bankhead. The Republican defeats the Democrat 52 to 44. But Bodnar, the independent, only beats the Republican if the Democrat is not on the ballot. And you wrote something that really stuck with me. The anti-Alme vote in Montana is big enough to win the state, but only if voters don't view the race as the usual D versus R choice, and only if the Democrat and independent don't split the vote. Talk to me about that dynamic. Talk to me about, how you got to those conclusions, or at least how the poll got to those conclusions, and take me inside that look at the anti-Republican vote only works if the Democrat drops out.
Yeah, and I'll just say, by way of perfect clarity for the audience, this is a poll that I wrote about for my newsletter, Strength in Numbers, but just putting that out there, I did not conduct it. So my analysis is independent of the data generating process behind this number. The poll was conducted by a pollster called Greenberg Quinlan Rosner here in Washington. So nothing I'm about to say is affirming the data driven process that I have created to give these results.
And that's fair.
Yeah, but it's super important, right? Because we get data all the time and analysis from the same shop, and you never really know what's going on under the hood. Look, in a state like Montana, you've got a lot of Republicans, and you've got a lot of Democrats who don't necessarily look like the types of Democrats you get in places like Washington, D.C. or Virginia, where I'm from. That is to say, they are more moderate, and they're culturally very distinct from the National Democratic Party. These voters tend to support Democratic candidates who share those sort of culturally Montanan values, let's call them. So your former Senator John Tester, for example, is able to outrun the Democratic presidential ticket in Montana for a very long time, until, of course, he couldn't when he had to be reelected in a presidential year, and there's less split ticket voting going on. This is, I think, just important context to understand what we're seeing in the Montana polls today, which is the Democratic candidate that's on the ballot now has even less of a personal brand separation from the National Democratic Party, which is, of course, very unpopular in a state like Montana. And so if you pit the Republican, the sort of natural type of candidate you would get out of a red-leaning state like Montana against just the Democrat, you're going to get a predictably partisan result. In the case of this survey, Republican Kurt Alme outperforming Lonnie Bankhead by 8 percentage points in this survey. If, however, you take that culturally non-Montanan Democrat off the ballot and instead replace her with a independent candidate, in this case Seth Bodnar, and you re-ask voters whether or not they would support Bodnar instead of Bankhead, you get a lot more independents, moderate Democrats, some moderate Republicans switching their vote, saying, actually, this independent guy, this Bodnar guy, he's more palatable to me than that Democrat. And I'll just say one more thing, which is, in this race, you have a particular problem, which is that the Democratic candidate Bankhead has not raised any money because the national political party is not supporting her. They want her to drop out of this race. In this case, I'm talking about the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, no support at all. And funders don't want to invest in the race either because they'd rather her drop out so that Bodnar can have a higher probability of defeating the Republican. And that's probably causing her to do worse as well.
The reason that this article got my attention is because it really echoes what happened here in Utah in 2022 when the Democrats decided to sit out that U.S. Senate race against Mike Lee and let independent Evan McMullin take him on one-on-one. And that was a really tough decision for the party to make. But I would argue that it was the right decision because even though Mike Lee won by about 10.5 points, it was the closest U.S. Senate race in Utah since 1992 when Republican Bob Bennett defeated Democrat Wayne Owens by just under 16%. So if you look at it that way, it was a success because if you look at how the Democrats in Utah have fared going back to 1994, the average margin of victory for the Republicans was about 35%. So to get within almost just about 10 points of a senator like Mike Lee has to be viewed as a success. We're also seeing the same thing in Nebraska because you write that Dan Osborne, independent, came within 7 points of Deb Fischer in 2024. He's running again, and now he's either tied or ahead of the Republican candidate as an independent. Do you think that this dynamic is driven by Democratic voters strategically shifting to a more viable independent, or are independent voters defecting from the GOP candidate? I'm wondering if you've got a beat on that.
Well, it's a little bit of both. Yeah. So there's fewer defections among the moderate Democrats for these independents. And then there's more independent and Republican crossover to the independent category instead of the Democratic category. And if I can take off my pollster hat and put on my political scientist hat here real quick, this makes sense, right? Because voters in political science, we say use heuristics to decide who to vote for, sort of information shortcuts. And the most powerful heuristic is, of course, in voting, your party identity. You're a Republican or a Democrat, you vote for a Republican or a Democrat. But whoa, here's a new election. There's not a Democrat anymore. There's an independent. That shortcuts your heuristic. Prevents you from using the same psychological shortcut you, in this case, you as like an independent or a sort of moderate Republican had used previously, but to vote against a Democratic candidate. And it unlocks some malleability of your political psychology and allows you to rationalize into different voter choices. Not to say that voting for a Republican is irrational. I'm just saying that the process of rationalization in your brain, thinking through your choices, and you think more about your choices, and rather than using your default heuristics, might come to a different choice if those heuristics are removed. So you definitely saw something similar with Evan McMullin, and independents have a pretty strong track record as well, as you raise, in Nebraska because of this sort of shortcutting of the information shortcut. It's like all the voters in these states are sort of on a Mario Kart race, and they typically go one way. But whoa! Here's a shortcut through the mountain, and some of them are going to take that shortcut.
Another thing that you wrote in that article is that Democrats are losing that seat in Montana because the party is viewed too negatively to win in deep red states. We're seeing that toxic brand here in Utah as well. Utah voters are not buying what Republicans are selling, but when they were given the option of a Republican, and Mike Lee, he's not well regarded outside of the Republican Party. He is a base Republican candidate, and that's what's pretty much carried him to victory, along with the fact that the Democrats here in Utah have a toxic brand. But voters here in Utah aren't buying what the Democrats are selling. So it seems like this strategy won't work everywhere. It just has to work in states where, especially in these deep red states, where the Democrats are not seen as a viable choice by a large part of the electorate when it comes to voting.
Yeah, there's of course the problem that Republican policy priorities, policy positions are increasingly out of step with the electorate at large, and also, if not increasingly unpopular, then decreasingly popular in a formerly very red state like Utah that has seen a lot of demographic change. But also, I don't have to tell you and your listeners this, but it's like politically unique in its attachment to the parties, in that the LDS Church and the culture around LDS has offers a sort of different heuristic for voting as well, and can separate some people from their left-right orientation that you might otherwise expect based off of values. At the same time, right, like Mike Lee is even special case of this, with a lot of his, his vote to sell off a lot of public land is definitely at odds with the, the support for public lands, belonging to the public in a state that you'd get in Utah and the broader political West. And then there's the Trump factor, which is the other part of this. I mean, Donald Trump is so unpopular in our tracking that he's even pulling close to even in a state like Utah, which voted for him by double digits. If you reran the 2024 election, I'm not sure if Donald Trump wins Utah, of course, depending on who the Democratic opponent is. So that would be so like the state, maybe just summarizes, is much less red than you would expect based off of its voting history, and that has a lot to do with the particular positions of both your senator and also the president.
This dynamic we're seeing in Montana, how much do you think it is driven by the animus towards a Republican Party or towards the desire to beat a Republican versus negative partisanship? Do you think that voters who would vote for the independent candidate, are they driven by a desire to defeat the Republican no matter who it is, or do you think that they're genuinely attracted to the independent candidate and what they're putting forward? Do you have any insight into that? Because I'm curious, because one of the biggest drivers in our politics today is negative partisanship. You vote against something rather than voting for something.
Yeah, there is there's definitely, I think, a lot of negative partisanship going on in this polling that's showing Bodnar, the independent, leading the Republican in Montana. But the entire point of running the independent is that partisanship, the forces of partisanship are acting less upon voter psychology, and that means there's less pro-Republican voting, but also a little bit less anti-Republican voting, at least in the sort of heuristic literature. But it's also possible that those independents are arriving at a more anti-Republican place than they would otherwise arrive at because of the particular policies of this administration, and cost of living increases, just like the general, not to be too Gen Z about it, the general vibes of the last year.
I think that that's fair. I've been watching with great fascination your tracking of the president's approval ratings across all 50 states. And there's only a handful of states where he's in positive territory. And I think in your last article on this, you showed the president was either just barely above water or running about even. It was kind of surprising for a state that he's carried 3 times, even though his margin of victory in a couple of those elections was closer than a lot of other states that we see. Do you think that that's just because of the president's approval rating nationwide is on a downward swing and he's hitting near historical lows or going to historical lows, maybe even hitting his floor of his support, and it's dragging everywhere around it? Or do you think that something else might be at play? I guess yeah. I didn't word the question correctly. It's do you think that this nationwide thing is why we're seeing his approval rating being dragged down in so many states, especially ones that have supported him in the past?
Yeah, definitely there is a general, let's call it like a gravitational pull downward in all of these states. that supported him, or even swing states, just naturally, like all voters, regardless of where they live in the United States, are subject to roughly the same media content, social media pressures, and they, of course, mostly experience the political environment roughly similarly. So if the president's making big missteps or inflation's out of control in one state, it tends to be out of control everywhere. There's a chart of this on my website. If you just take the results of the 2024 election, in which Donald Trump wins by 1.5 percentage points in the national vote, and you shift the entire country about 23 percentage points to the left, which gets you to a 25 percentage point net disapproval rating, which is what the polls show today he is at nationally. So you're following this, you just take every state and you shift it the amount the whole country has moved according to the national polls. Then you get, Donald Trump is popular in like 10 states or so. He's just barely net negative in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Utah. Of course, every swing state at that point is underwater. That would just be your sort of national tide. And then if you compare that to Trump's rating in individual states based off of opinion polls in those states, or models of national data projected onto the state level. I do some of that myself. And you just look at those states that look to have moved more than you would think based off the national polls, then you do see some extra movement in places like Utah, but also the sort of farming states, Iowa, Nebraska, even the Dakotas to a lesser extent. Of course, there's not much farming in North Dakota, and that might have something to do with tariffs. Equally, I guess I should just mention Donald Trump is a lot less popular than you would expect in the border states, especially Arizona, New Mexico, to a lesser extent in Florida and California and Texas, maybe because of mass deportations.
All those are some very, very, very interesting numbers. I want to get to your projections that you've written at 50+1, looking at the possibility of the Democrats taking control of either the House, the Senate, or both chambers in the midterm elections. And there was a statement that has stuck with me for the past couple of weeks. It was a GOP strategist named David Winston, and he said, if you look at the polls, and if Democrats maintain a lead on the economy among voters, and if that's one of the factors that they're looking at, and if you see independents breaking towards Democrats rather than Republicans by double digits, then the possibility of a blue wave starts to come into focus. And that's exactly what we seem to be seeing in these polls, is that the Americans are trusting Democrats, or the Democrats have a lead on who would handle the economy better in this polling that we're seeing. And you're seeing independents saying they would vote for a Democrat over a Republican. I think the last poll I saw was around 17 points. And that sort of couples with what you've seen with your projections at 50+1, where you say that Democrats have an 85% chance of taking control of the House and a 55% chance of taking control of the Senate. Can you talk about those ratings, how you came up with those numbers, and if you think that the economic factor is going to be one of the biggest drivers in this election?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump's affordability problem is his number one problem, and there is a bit of a shooting himself in the foot dynamic in regards to that. I mean, he campaigned in 2024 on the promise of getting prices back down. Of course, any economist will tell you getting prices back down is very hard, but also would entail a lot of economic harm, because it means prices for labor are decreasing, so people are making less money. Businesses are going out of business because they're making less money, or they have to fire people. And generally, for the most part, like prices of manufactured goods overseas are really hard to get down. Those are subject to other forces across in foreign countries as well. So you would get deflation, which would be politically very unpopular. So he promises to get prices back down, and basically he can't. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. It would be even worse politically for the situation he is in now, and that created a pretty rough baseline for him to be graded against for for his presidency. So you ask voters how do you feel about Donald Trump's presidency on prices? I think at this point voters are 40 points negative for him. So close to 70% saying they disapprove, and about 30% saying they approve of the job he's doing as president on prices. And then what we know from studying American political history is that how voters feel about prices and the economy is one of, if not the number one predictor of future election results, electoral tides, because there's a lot of voters who really just make their decisions on who to vote for based on like their pocketbook, their bank account, and how they're doing, which is, of course, fair enough. That's their prerogative, really. So that's his number one problem. And there's the added problem that basically he's underwater on everything else he's doing as well, to name two things: mass deportations and immigration enforcement, domestic immigration enforcement, that has ended quite tragically and violently for several American citizens and many thousands of immigrants, undocumented immigrants. And secondly, the war in Iran, which started out as the most unpopular foreign policy, major foreign policy action, war, conflict, whatever he wants to call it, when it started, and has only gotten worse. That was a real betrayal of the other promise he made in his campaign, which was an end to foreign wars. I don't know if you remember, he was campaigning against Kamala Harris, saying she was going to start World War III. And lo and behold, here we are. So that has provided basically any American who cares about a pet issue and looks at the president, issues a pretty negative reaction today.
And Trump's not on the ballot, and we've seen that when Trump's not on the ballot, Republicans typically struggle at the polls because, Trump tends to bring out a lot of voters who want to vote specifically for him. And I think that might be one of the reasons why you're projecting that the Democrats have an 85% chance of taking the House. But looking at the flip side, what sort of things would it take for those probabilities to flip back into the Republicans' behavior or favor? Because we're starting to run out of time. I mean, we're just a couple of months from the election right now. And, it seems like these attitudes are getting more and more locked in as we get closer and closer to election day.
Yeah. There's basically nothing Donald Trump can do to shore up his party's position in the House race. I'm not being flippant here, but it would take a 9/11 style event to change the political environment enough for the president's party to hold its majority in the House. And that statement is based on history. The only time the president has held the party of the president has held their House majority in the last 100 years, 80 years, excuse me, there was one time in the 30s, was 2002, after 9/11. Otherwise, the president loses, on average, 26, 27 seats in the House of Representatives. Sometimes they only lose 5. Okay, fair enough. But Donald Trump's party can only lose 3. And the national generic ballot polls that we track that show what party people say they'll vote for in their local congressional district, those are around, Democrats leading by 7-8 percentage points. And the typical pattern is for the out party, the opposition party, in this case, the Democrats, to gain ground as people tune in for the midterms. So there's really nothing that can happen there. The Senate is a toss-up, so totally possible that Republicans retain their majority. Maybe they have a 1 seat extra. Right now they have they can lose 3 senators. And then J.D. Vance has to break a tie, so technically 4. You can lose 4 senators. If they're in the position where they're governing, where Donald Trump can only pass his agenda if he gets Democrats in the House on board, and or gets a couple of Republicans to switch over to vote for the Democrats, or basically this is just a recipe for gridlock in Washington is what's going to end up happening. And if you're the president, there's really no way around that conclusion at this point.
I think that's well put. Last thing I want to ask you, and I really appreciate your time today. Given the changes because of redistricting heading into the 2026 cycle, How much do you think that that's going to help Republicans at the ballot box? Because ostensibly they're going to they gained a number of seats in Republican states like Texas, where they redistricted, and California. They changed their maps to counterbalance that. And here in Utah, we had a court-ordered redistricting that created a Democratic leaning seat in Salt Lake County. Do you think that had the redistricting not taken place, do you think that the environment would have been shaping up for an even larger bloodbath among the Republicans at the ballot box? I guess what I'm trying to ask is how much of a factor is this redistricting going to be to mitigate losses by the Republicans in the House?
Well, if there had been no redistricting, or well, let me put it this way. The redistricting situation we have now has essentially cost Democrats about 6 seats in the House. If you rerun our election forecast using the boundaries from the 2024 election instead, the Democrats are doing about 6 seats better. If Virginia had kept, and I'm in Virginia, if Virginia had kept its blue gerrymander, basically, which the Supreme Court struck down here, then it would be closer to a wash, maybe like 2 seats in the Republicans' favor instead of 6 or maybe 7. And even in that scenario, which was the one that looked really likely as recently as April, Democrats also would have been a lock, basically. 98. I wouldn't have given you 2 cents on the dollar, right? 98% chance to win the election in that scenario. Basically, in other words, the only reason Republicans have any chance at all of holding their majority in the House is because they have cheated in these states and rigged the maps in their favor at Donald Trump's behest. So that is the situation in redistricting. But our election forecast at 50plus1.news takes into account the redistricting scenario for what it's worth.
He just mentioned 50plus1.news. You can also find his work at Strength in Numbers, which is a tremendous website. If you like digging into polling, if you like polling numbers, this is probably the best place to go on the internet. Elliott, where can people find you on social?
Oh, I try not to spend any time on social media. Yeah, you can come to my website, and then if you have questions, you can email me.
I think that's smart. I guess that's why I haven't seen yourself on social. I'm just
I don't go there.
Okay, excellent. Well, I am saying I will say that it's probably in your best interest to check out his work at 50plus1.news and at Strength in Numbers as well. Elliott Morris, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks, Bryan.